patience. What happened when a doctor or nurse accused you of faking it when you were actually in need of urgent medical care? Story 1. Not as a patient, but as a parent of a patient. My wife and I started to suspect that something was wrong with our son starting at age 2. He would run around all day and was an active little guy, but never sweat. He would also never appear to get cold. We live in New England, and he would often take his shirt off before going to sleep, even in the winter months. These concerns were dismissed as a toddlers are weird sort of thing by his doctor. We later noticed that he would stop and complain about his hands or feet hurting while playing or laying in bed. These were also dismissed. We were told that the pain in his feet could be because his feet are flat or because of growing pains. We were told that it could also be attention related. The doctor said that it's not uncommon for middle children to act out. This continued for 4 years. My sister is a biologist and asked us if we ever got him checked for Fabry disease. I flat out asked the doctor if he could be tested, and the doctor told us that there was no way this was Fabry and they weren't going to test a kid without any genetic history of the disorder. The disorder is genetic, and without a classic sign, one that often doesn't show up until adulthood, if it shows up at all. We waited until our son was literally screaming in bed about his hands and feet feeling like they were on fire. We demanded to get him tested, and he was diagnosed with Fabry. It's essentially a metabolic disorder caused by a missing enzyme. There are many issues associated with it, but the main one is extreme neuropathic pain in the hands and feet. The pain can be random, but with my son, it's normally because he overheated since he lacks the ability to sweat. He plays sports, so we have to be careful. Overactivity and fevers have to be watched out for since his body can't cool itself down. Pain can last anywhere from a couple of minutes to a couple of days. The average age of diagnosis for this disorder is around 16, so it's not surprising that the doctor missed it. Most doctors do since it's a rare disorder. That was a little over a year ago, and my son is doing well now. There is no cure, but treatment allows him to live a relatively normal life, just with some added pain. I couldn't imagine making him wait until his teens to get any relief. I knew someone with this. He borrowed my ex-husband's cooling vest from Glacier Tech. Ex has MS, some symptoms brought on by heat, last year to see if it helped, and wound up ordering 2 for intense days. Maybe worth a check. Well, I'm glad this person got checked out. I'm glad the kid got checked out. And I'm glad that they didn't really blame the doctor. They probably should have listened and maybe got him checked out, but it sounds like it's not something that happens until 16. But waiting 4 years for something that has that much pain, I couldn't imagine what that kid was going through. Story 2. I was losing my hair. My gums bleed randomly. My skin looked like butt. My muscles cramp up randomly. I literally fell over once while standing on both of my feet. I got horribly depressed. The world felt like cardboard is the only way I can think to describe it. And all I wanted to do was eat and sleep. Sometimes I would start talking in conversation and get a word jumble midway through where the words didn't come out right, which was the beginning of some social anxiety for me. I went to several doctors who plainly thought I was full of trash. Several of them asked me how much I drank, and one of them asked me over and over again as if he didn't believe me when I said I didn't. I was tested for low thyroid, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, and some other scary things, but nothing came up. This was over a 6-month period. I finally figured it out by Googling my symptoms, which led me to a message board that suggested I find a doctor who would give me a blood test for it so I would know for sure. Turns out I was really, really low on B12, somewhere in the low 300s, I think. They went from nearly eye-rolling me to my face to giving me a B12 shot in the office before I left on my second visit and prescribing sublingual B12 to me. I actually found out a few years later that I have a gene mutation that keeps me from methylating vitamins. I mention it to every new doctor I see now, and they always look at me like I'm a hypochondriac. Then look it up on their laptop and kind of go, okay, like they're relieved I'm not full of trash. It took me 1.5 years to find a doctor who tested me for B12 and gave me shots. Mentally, it was really difficult to describe my state. I am so happy I never have to relive that again. Wow. Just aside from the condition being kind of rare, you would think that a doctor would be able to test for something like a vitamin deficiency. That kind of sounds like something common you would test for. What do you think? Story 3. Not exactly accused of faking it, but here's my story. One night I was working at this bar, and suddenly I am overcome with an excruciating pain in my abdomen, lower left quadrant just below my rib cage. I would rate the pain a solid 9. And the only reason I don't say 10 is because I've never been shot, stabbed, or anything like that, so I reserve my 10s for the really extreme stuff. But it was a serious pain, the kind where I couldn't even carry a conversation. The pain backs off to about a 5, so I duck out of work, thinking I'll go home and see if it happens again. But on the way, it jumps back up to a 9 again, maybe a 9.5. I pull over at a gas station and call 911 because I can't drive and I don't know if I'm expiring or what. I writhe in agony for 10 to 15 minutes while I wait for an ambulance, and wouldn't you freaking know it, the pain drops to a 0 the second they get there. The paramedics check me out, do an EKG, what have you. I'm fine. They took me to the ER. Triage nurse decides I'm fine and I have to wait. When I finally see a doctor, it's this ticked-off resident who's probably on hour 61 of her shift. By this time, my mom and stepdad had arrived. The doctor has a thick accent, and my stepdad very casually asks her where the accent hails from. Purely making small talk, no malice whatsoever. The lady gets all bent out of shape about it, like, does it matter where I'm from? Anyway, from that point on, she's not listening to anything I'm saying. She asks me if I've had alcohol in the last 24 hours, and I say, yes, I had a nightcap last night. She asks, what's a nightcap? I told her it's a drink right before bed to help you sleep. I tell her I had a whiskey. 1 whiskey, and it's truly all I've had in the previous 24 hours. She finds the concept of a whiskey before bed baffling. She says she doesn't believe that's all I had to drink. She basically tells me I'm an alcoholic, I'm not, and that the pain was from drinking too much. And then she discharges me. I've never felt that pain before or since, and I have no clue what it was. But a crabby doctor chalked it up to a BS diagnosis, and that was that. I was thinking that when she said she was going to have a whiskey, there was going to be like a House MD moment, and there would be some sort of like weird medical explanation for what was going on. But I guess this one is still just a mystery. Well, I guess that happens. Story 4. This isn't so much a faking it situation, but more of my ex-girlfriend having to deal with a really incompetent security guard that hindered her getting medical help. My ex had a severe peanut allergy, and one time she ate a Thai chicken pizza in the college cafeteria that did not list peanuts as one of the ingredients. After her throat started burning, she knew something was wrong, so she grabbed a glass of milk, which I guess helped a bit, and went outside for some air because she was having trouble breathing. A security guard was passing outside in front of the building and saw that she might need some help. At this point, my ex was panicking and frantically looking through her bag for her EpiPen. The security guard asked what was wrong, and she tried to explain that she had a severe peanut allergy and needed to be taken to the hospital. When the security guard saw her take out the EpiPen, she took it from her and said that it was school policy that she be the one to do it. She then asked her to hold out her arm so she could inject her. My girlfriend could not believe that the security guard was trying to inject her arm like it was a flu shot, and out of frustration, she yanked it from the guard's hand and put it in her thigh like you're supposed to, and sternly told her, I need to get to a hospital now. For future notice to any allergy sufferers that have EpiPens, if anyone tries to take your EpiPen and play hero, kick them in the shin and do it yourself. Likely you have more experience in training with auto-injectors than anyone else. Story 5. Not a doctor or nurse, but a bunch of camp counselors and the infirmary doc. I went to a sleepaway camp for children with cancer or anything chronic and or life-threatening. It's the second day, and I wake up feeling a little bit sick with a sore throat. Okay, I'll just drink some water and I'll be okay. It's the summer, after all. I can't get sick. Breakfast rolls around 10 a.m., and I'm not hungry, and my throat is getting worse. I tell one of my counselors that I'm not feeling good, and he says, "Eat something. Wait till after the morning activity." I couldn't bring myself to swallow and just sit there and then go to arts and crafts. I feel so sick at this point, I just sit in the corner of the arts and crafts room, literally fading in and out. I tell a different counselor, and he says, "Drink some water." I do. It doesn't help at all. I realize that they're not going to do anything unless I make a big deal about it, so I think to stand up and make an announcement. When I stand up, I immediately need to sit down again, and now my throat hurts too much to talk. A third counselor walks up to me and asks how I'm doing. I say, "I don't feel good," in my raspy, weak voice. He says, "Wait until after this activity." Lunch comes around at 12:30, and I go to the bathroom before sitting down, and I look like a zombie in the bathroom mirror. I go back to my table and say I can't eat. The counselors ask why. I say, "I feel sick." One of the counselors begrudgingly agreed to take me to the infirmary, which was a mini hospital because all the kids here had medical issues. I can barely walk, but I make it there, and promptly get sat down on an old wood bench and left alone as my counselor walks back to eat lunch. After about 15 minutes of waiting, a doctor pokes her head out of her office and asks me what's wrong. I tell her, "I've felt sick since I woke up. My throat hurts." She feels my forehead and says, "You don't feel warm, but I'll get a thermometer." She comes back with a thermometer and puts it under my tongue. I had a fever of 102 and strep throat at a tightly packed dining hall surrounded by kids with compromised immune systems. I'm surprised I didn't get anyone sick, but the fact that it took 5 hours to get a chronically sick kid some freaking medical attention still makes my blood boil. I was bedridden for 3 days and missed literally everything I wanted to do while there. The worst part was, this was my last year before I got too old. Story 6. I fell down a flight of stairs one time while working, hit a nail on the way down and ripped my forearm open and was bleeding a good bit. Adrenaline had me going long enough for my girlfriend, a nurse at another hospital, to drive me there. I had a bloody paper towel on my arm, and all the security guards and nurses assumed I was a junkie that blew a vein. Finally, all the hype wore off, and I kind of passed out and woke up in a wheelchair in the exam room. I don't know exactly what happened, but my girlfriend was flipping her lid on the workers. She said half of them assumed I was on illicit substances, and the other half thought I was faking it to skip the line. I wasn't perishing of blood loss or anything. I just got woozy when I actually was able to see the meat in my arm for the first time. They all just watched me as I fell to the floor and busted my head on the floor. Even then, they didn't do anything. My girlfriend, who's not even half my size, as I'm not a small guy at all, had to pick me up and drag me into the wheelchair. Curse that hospital. Yeah, my mom watched an old lady expire from blood loss in an ER a couple decades ago. She just nodded off and collapsed, and the nurses didn't do anything for hours. My mom tried to yell at them to do something, but this was before she had learned English, so nothing came of it. Was this guy working at a hospital in an area where a lot of addicts were coming in trying to get substances from them? Or were they just that non-empathetic? What do you think? Story 7. When I was 9, I would get stomach aches when I went to school. My doctor insisted I was faking, but my mom insisted he take it seriously. Finally, they gave me a barium x-ray and saw I had a stomach ulcer. I had to take Maalox and drink milk at every meal and snack. I even had to get special permission to get milk from the cafeteria at morning recess. My teacher ridiculed me for that. She was horrible and abusive. While I never received any of her physical abuse, there were 2 other boys in my class who got it on a regular basis. This would have been 1980, so it wasn't normal for teachers to be pulling hair or knocking a kid's face into a desk. Every Friday, the 3 of us would have to stay after school while she told us all how stupid we were. My stomach aches did not get better, and the doctor accused me of some combination of faking, exaggerating, or non-compliance. We literally had to save all the empty Maalox bottles to prove I was really taking my daily doses. Today, we know that having me drink milk 6-7 times a day was exacerbating things. And in retrospect, my mom never really understood how stressful it was being in that class. It wasn't until the last few months of 4th grade, when they finally transferred me to another classroom, that I got well again. Later, my mom told me that even she thought I'd been exaggerating when I talked about how mean the teacher was. Because I'd left the honors class, moved down a level, my former teacher still ridiculed me pretty frequently when we crossed paths, but it didn't tie my stomach up in knots. Story 8. Not my child, my brother. He was 11 and suddenly tired and lethargic. He missed a lot of school. He hated missing school. My mother kept taking him in, and they'd say it's the flu or puberty or mono, and it would never get better. After a few weeks of this, my mom brought him to the hospital again and yelled at his doctors that something was seriously wrong with her son, and they needed to do their jobs and figure out what it was. It was leukemia. They called the next morning just before 2 a.m. and said the tests came back. Your son needs to come in now, not in the morning, right now. I can't imagine what happens to a parent at that moment when you know it's bad because they call you at 2 a.m., but you don't know why. He was in treatment for just over a year and was diagnosed on his birthday. A few months later, he had a bone marrow transplant and was able to come home pretty quickly. There were complications from the transplant, called graft versus host disease, like organ rejection, but the new cells try to reject you. It attacked his musculoskeletal system, causing stiffness in some dangerous situations. This October will be 8 years since the transplant, and he's cancer-free. That boy loves to use the cancer card now, but he definitely earned the right. Story 9. I wouldn't call it urgent medical care, but I was stuck in my room for about 5 hours on my bed with my head pressed into my shoulder because I had a pinched nerve. I had never had one before. I wasn't able to move my head at all, and when my mom got home from work, she called an ambulance for me. They carried me out in a sitting position, and off to the hospital we went. When we got there, it took about a half hour for me to get into the hospital bed, and ended up just giving up and leaving me sitting upright. The doctor pulled my mom out of the room and asked if I had a history of faking injuries in order to get painkillers, because I was pressing against the pain instead of leaning my head away from it. Whenever I get cluster headaches, I find that counterpressure against the pain feels better than none. Had people questioning if I was really in pain or not. You mean there's never been a situation ever where relief from some sort of pain was to lean into it rather than get away from it? I don't know. Whenever I have something sore or something, if I, overextended my wrist or something like that, kind of rubbing on the pain kind of helps it go away, or at least it's therapeutic. It doesn't seem all that uncommon to me. Story 10. Changing it up just a little. My colleagues were convinced a girl was just faking a stomachache. She was about 16 years old, and it was exam session, a time when we would get many sudden tummy aches, fits, etc., so I understood their skepticism, but something didn't sit right with me. I took her history myself and sent her for an emergency ultrasound of her abdomen. Ectopic pregnancy. It was ready to rupture at any moment, so I shipped her over to OBS-GYN to get surgery ASAP. She came out just fine, but man, oh man, did I give my coworkers a hard time after that. Exam season or not, we need to be thorough. Had another time when it was just me and one other doctor working admission. She dismissed a case of a little girl faking fatigue for attention. Thankfully, I overheard her telling someone, so I went to double check. The poor girl was having a carpal pedal spasm and was most definitely not faking her condition. Hooked her up to some calcium and sent her home with meds the next day. I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm perfect, but in our line of work we must always be a little paranoid. Thank you for being conscientious, thorough, and taking your oath seriously. It's truly the difference between life and unlife.
Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 11. Was 12 years old and had a heart problem that was just starting to show. Arrhythmia and palpitations only happened when overexerting myself. Went to a cardiologist and was accused of faking it to get out of chores and soccer practice. By the time I'm 15, my heart is absolutely unreliable throughout the day. During an attack, I would lose my sight and pass out. Same cardiologist still claimed I was faking it. Kids just don't have heart conditions. I am 16 years old, and my heart finally stops. Luckily, I passed out earlier at school and was in the nurse's office when my heart stopped after another episode. Woke up in the hospital and, by the way, had a heart deformation that required surgery. My doctor blew her lid, according to my doctor, wanting to see me unalive. Went to his office and threw his degrees and awards off his wall at him and was screaming at him. Only reason she didn't sue was to prevent assault charges. Simple echocardiography showed growth, causing the electricity to pump my heart to go in circles. Wasn't fun having heart attack simulations nearly every day for 4 years. Before anyone asks, I was poor, and that cardiologist was the only one on my mother's insurance. Story 12. Not me, but my mother. She had been very sick and tired. Imagine a cold, but it's 100 times worse. The doctor she saw multiple times kept basically blowing it off, saying she just needed some rest. It kept getting worse. One day I was home with her. She was in bed sleeping, and I was out in the living room watching TV. For some reason, she decided to walk out into the living room and sit in the chair across from the couch. She looked like a legit zombie, and when she sat down, she could barely hold her head up. I immediately called 911. Turned out she had pneumonia and one of her lungs was entirely full of fluid, while the other was more than halfway. She spent a few days in the hospital and fully recovered. I don't know what made her decide to walk into the living room, but if she hadn't done that, she likely would have perished that day. All of that could have been avoided if the doctor she saw would have just paid closer attention to what was going on. Every time I've gone to the ER with anything, the first thing they do is a chest x-ray to check, plus blood work to check everything else. Story 13. When I was 16, I was in a really dark place, and one day I decided to confide to my doctor that I thought I might be depressed and see what he would recommend. Dude straight up laughed in my face and said, "You're not depressed. You're just a teenager." I told my mom I wanted to change doctors after that, and it took another year and tons of self-destructive behavior before I sought help again. Same thing happened to me. I begged for help at 15, got told I was an over-dramatic teenager that just wanted attention despite how intense my mood swings were and the self-unaliving attempts. Never asked for help again until I had a 4-month depressive episode at 22. Turns out I'm bipolar 2. Story 14. To my doctor's credit, we both kind of had a laugh at this one before the test results came back. I went to my primary because I'd been experiencing hot flashes. Dr. Google couldn't tell me what was wrong, and I knew it didn't feel right. "Well, at least we know it isn't menopause," my doctor jokes. I laughed. What 23-year-old woman spontaneously goes through menopause? This one. My doctor was very apologetic. My mom went through full menopause at 36, and it turned out it was caused in part by Hashimoto's, which they also didn't know she had until she was in her 60s. I'm glad your doctor did tests and helped you. Story 15. This is not as serious or urgent a condition as the others, but it still manages to raise my blood pressure years later. Starting from when I was about 7, I would have terrible stomach pains, which my pediatrician claimed was attention-seeking behavior. He told my parents that they should punish me any time I complained of stomach problems. My parents, who love yelling, jumped at a new reason to scream at me on a nearly daily basis. When I went to college, I was finally diagnosed as having a hiatal hernia, just like my grandparents, father, and aunt. When I was a kid, they even commented that I had the same symptoms they did, which for my pediatrician meant that I was just mimicking their complaints and didn't have the same condition. Because it had been untreated for so long, I now have to worry about Barrett's and esophageal cancer. Lucky me. Story 16. Broke my foot in 5 different places, but the scan only showed one little tear. They sent me home and were like, "You'll be back to normal in 6 weeks." 6 weeks later, and my foot was still swollen and bruised, and I couldn't stand on it, so I went back. The doctor said, "Well, I can see on the old scan you had just one little tear. Maybe you need to try harder, but we'll do an MRI on your foot." Few days later, I came back for the results. The doctor said, "Well, sometimes a regular scan can't see everything, and as we look at your foot here, and here, you can see the broken bone fragments. It's already healing just fine, but this will take months to heal completely. No wonder you couldn't walk." I wasn't in that much pain, and if they saw the breaks at the scan, I would have needed a cast for 6 weeks at least, so I don't really mind what happened. Story 17. Several years ago, I walked into traffic in a sort of vague, being unalive would be nice kind of way. When I told my psychologist about it, he rightfully had me carted off to the ER to be admitted into inpatient care. They shuffled me from room to room and eventually stuck me with this teenage girl who appeared to be having severe pregnancy complications. In the hall, I could hear a woman screaming and vomiting violently. We sat there for hours. Finally, the doctor came. By this point, I was completely numb. She asked me questions, and I answered. "Do you have any plans for self-unaliving? I'm not really the planning type." She finally said, "Well, you look fine to me," and sent me home. I bussed to my apartment and lay face down on my couch for several hours. Story 18. I was in labor, and because it was my first, they acted like I had no idea what was happening and kept denying what I was insisting. I was over 2 months early and handled pain so well, they acted like it was just in my head. Made me stand at the counter filling out paperwork while I insisted I needed to push. They decided to lay me down to check if I had even started dilating, and I promptly pushed him out. I was furious with how I was treated. I still am. Same here. Well, they wanted me to wait for the doctor. Finally, I just started screaming and pushing. They all finally rushed in to help me. Story 19. Not exactly accused of faking it, more so just disbelieved or taken lightly. I went to emergency at the hospital because it was Saturday for a medium-level abdominal pain that had been ongoing since the previous weekend. I'd been to the GP on Wednesday or Thursday and had a blood test booked for the coming Tuesday, earliest possible. However, my mom decided to take me in because of how long it had lasted without change. At the hospital, I had a blood test taken, and the doctor thought 50 milligrams of codeine would take care of my non-problem. It did nothing, so he gave another one and Panadol. He ended up believing and sending everyone frantic when I ended up bent over, frothing at the mouth and coughing up blood, and the blood test said pancreatitis. Story 20. New hearing doctor didn't believe that I needed hypoallergenic molds and ended up making regular ones to try them out. Within a few days, my left ear was sore. It hurt a lot more than usual. Doctor and ear specialist thought it was just a little bit of irritation, and that it should clear up quickly. It ended up being a major middle/inner ear infection. Ruptured the eardrum, pus and blood everywhere on my pillow. About a month of agony, a lot of pharmaceuticals, and a lot of specialists in the hospital. I was already very hard of hearing, and that junk made me lose another 10 decibels permanently. Story 21. Not really accused me of faking, but misdiagnosed me. I had a horrible loss of motivation and was so up and down with my emotions. I constantly slept and never felt rested, even after sleeping for 10 hours. Doctor told me I was just depressed and put me on meds. They made me feel like a zombie, and I couldn't concentrate, so I stopped taking them. A year later, I went in for a checkup with a different doctor, and he found a lump on my thyroid. Turns out I have Hashimoto's, causing my hormones to go up and down constantly. Basically, the other doctor was just putting a Band-Aid on symptoms and never bothered to find the underlying cause. Story 22. When I was in labor, the hospital had my records wrong and showed I was due a month later. I was ticked, especially since I was in labor and in a lot of pain. The lady kept arguing until she realized I was in labor. She must have heard all the stuff my boyfriend, now husband, were talking about her, because nobody has ever gone into early labor. Story 23. I can barely remember this, but I was around the age of 11. I went for a sore throat, severe cough that would make me dry heave, phlegm, just the whole thing. Doctor says it's all in my head, despite me having an obviously inflamed throat and a very wet cough. I remember sitting there with my grandma, who was like, I don't think it's in her head. I went back the same week and was diagnosed with walking pneumonia. I think that's when we switched doctors too. Story 24. I only have partial hearing in my left ear due to an idiot pediatrician. When I was 15, I had an ear infection. Between dumb alcoholic moms swearing up and down that everything I did was for attention, and this idiot who must have printed his diploma using MS Paint, I got no treatment. He didn't even look in my ear. It ruptured that night. Blood and pus everywhere over my pillow. The ER doc said I had the worst ear infection he'd ever seen. Story 25. My mother had a stroke at age 32. The doctors didn't diagnose it properly for over 24 hours because they were convinced her symptoms must have been related to illicit substances, since she was in good health and so young. My dad apparently tried to tell them that she has no history of substance use, but they didn't believe him. Now she's permanently disabled because of how long it took for her to receive proper treatment. Story 26. I passed out walking to school, so my brother called an ambulance. Paramedics were hesitant the second time it happened and began asking if I was trying to get out of a test or if someone was messing with me at school. Turned out I had stage 3 colon cancer at 17. Glad you're okay now. Story 27. In Army training, going to sick call made you a douchebag and trying to get out of training. Even doctors kind of brush off people because they see so many, some who are actually faking it. So when I went in with bad back pain, the medic clearing me brushed me off and told me to go back to my company. Turns out my kidney was severely infected. Story 28. My friend's dad went to the ER and the doctors said he was fine after minimal examination. Her dad insisted something was wrong and said he wouldn't leave until they ran some tests. As he was being escorted out by security, he had a brain aneurysm and expired. Her family was awarded a pretty massive malpractice settlement, but they were absolutely devastated. Story 29. I was 17 and had excruciating lower abdominal pain. I was sent home twice because I was young and it was probably just menstrual cramps. Third time I went to the ER, I happened to be on my period, so I told them I was also bleeding. Finally, the nurses passed me on to a doctor and gave me a scan and ultrasound. Had an ovarian cyst the size of a golf ball. Ended up losing my ovary. Story 30. Had an asthma attack once, and a middle school nurse didn't believe me. Told me to get up and go back to class. Took 5 steps out the door and passed out. Woke up in a hospital with tubes being jammed in my nose and a mask over my face. Oxygen and albuterol. And never was a claim about asthma ever not taken seriously ever again in that school district. Story 31. Not me, but my mother. She had called an ambulance because she had been experiencing chest pains, to which they basically told her she was crazy. About a month later, she passed away from a heart attack. That sucks, especially since doctors consider chest pains an emergency. Sorry for your loss. Story 32. A doctor didn't believe me when I had a kidney stone that was too big to pass. He only changed his mind when another doctor checked me and started freaking out since I was getting super sick from the stuck stone. The doctor ended up getting fired from the hospital, and my parents sued him.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.